So we are starting to be drip-fed more information about Christopher Nolan's Odyssey. And good news, we're going to get gods and monsters and all that heroic stuff which Troy conveniently forgot to put in. But as ever, there's been a lot of debate. One side seems to be very upset that the arms and armour and etc. is not period accurate, while the other half seems to argue, who cares? So let's dive in a month later, after everything has settled a bit, and see what we think. Before we can decide whether Nolan's trying to be accurate to the original works or not, we need to decide when was the original Odyssey actually set. So first off, the Odyssey was an epic poem supposedly written by someone called Homer as a follow-up to the Iliad all about the Trojan War. For a long time, scholarship assumed that Troy wasn't a real place at all. But as with any mythic city, people started actually looking for it. And in the 1870s, a bloke called Schliemann managed to actually find Troy and start excavating there. Unlike other archaeologists, he had the genius idea of asking someone who actually lived in the area where it might be. He was guided by someone called Calvert, who told him about the site, had already been digging there for 7 years, and actually owned the land. Now, Schliemann was not a perfect archaeologist. Some would say he wasn't an archaeologist at all. Certainly, I don't think we use much dynamite today, but Schliemann didn't seem a problem with this. In the wreckage, he found what he believed was Troy. He also found a lot of very valuable artifacts, including a lot of gold jewellery, which he promptly decorated his wife with, then smuggled out of the country, sold to a museum in Berlin, which ended up in Moscow after World War II. In his 8 digs at the site, he dug through the soil with not a huge amount of care and little record keeping, and the rubble of Schliemann's trench that you can see today is very, very different to the actual excavations of more recent work. But they seem to put the question to bed. Troy was a real city, located in northwest Turkey, at a place called Hisarlik. And it's easy to imagine why there would be a lot of conflict at this place. It controls the Strait of Bosphorus, as well as any traders trying to go around the Aegean Sea, and by controlling the trade east and west could be a very important city indeed. To add to the physical remains, we also have literary remains. To the Greeks, Troy was also known as Ilium, and in Hittite records from the end of the Bronze Age, there is talk of a series of conflicts around Ilusa. And several of the names recorded in the Iliad and the Odyssey are also reflected in Hittite records, suggesting that what Homer knew as the Trojan War was actually a series of conflicts conflated in one singular narrative. This is a really interesting topic, and if you want to know more about it, there is this great video which goes into a lot more depth. But scholars generally think that the Odyssey and the Iliad were composed in the 8th century BC, whereas the fall of Troy at the end of the Bronze Age happened almost 500 years earlier at the end of the 12th century. So how could Homer have possibly known about this and be singing about this earlier time? Well, in the 1920s, enter 2 men called Parry and Lord. They studied oral tradition in Eastern Europe and discovered that a lot of the hallmarks of oral tradition were present in Homer. Rather than the works being written down and handed down that way, they were sung over and over again. Now, the Iliad and the Odyssey are exceptional in terms of oral poetry, because they are so long and so complicated. However, the work of Parry and Lord fits the Odyssey into a really lovely little narrative. At the end of the Bronze Age, we had something called the Bronze Age collapse. The palatial system of the Mycenaean Greeks and the Minoan Cretans collapsed. Alongside trade networks, the quality of art, and importantly, the skill of writing. Writing was absent in Greece for 400 years. Between the Bronze Age collapse, when we have our Trojan War, and the 7th century, 8th century, when we have Homer, the story was passed down through this oral tradition. So then we have 2 dates potentially for Homer, either the Bronze Age collapse or when he composed it in the 8th century. In 566 BCE, the tyrant of Athens, Pisistratus, wanted a definitive version of Homer to be read at the first Panathenaea. He got all the leading Homeristae, these are the singers of Homer, together, and together they put together the Iliad and the Odyssey in a definitive version, and it is the traces of this version that we have today. Which gives us a 3rd date we could consider for the setting of our Odyssey. So then, was Homer set in the Bronze Age or his own time? Well, there are some problems with setting him in the Bronze Age. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, dead bodies tend to be cremated rather than buried, which is something much more of the classical period than the Bronze Age. The pantheon of gods is well established and all their roles clearly defined in the classical Greek fashion, as was the structure of worship, and some major Bronze Age themes seem to be missing, like the famous figure of 8 shields. The helmet of Odysseus is an exception, not the rule, and they seem to have generally classical age helmets. Yes, bronze seems to be used for weapons and iron for tools, but this could be a deliberate archaism, Homer making it sound older than it was. At a few times in the Odyssey and the Iliad, he talks about war through the metaphor of iron and iron weaponry, even though bronze should be the dominant. But, and there are a lot of buts. First of all, cremations. Yes, cremations were unusual in the Bronze Age, but there is evidence of them. And the great mounds we see for heroic burials of people like Elpenor or Patroclus seem to coincide very nicely with mound burials, and particularly the Mycenaean too, which also have this great beehive mound shape. Perhaps the necessities of war pushed people away from their traditional means of burial and towards cremation. Similarly, the pantheon of gods, we know that many of these gods were present from Linear B tablets. And in fact, in a lot of Homer's work, he seems to know far more about the Bronze Age than we would expect. His geography is very much Bronze Age, not that of his own time, and key players like Mycenae and Pylos, who were the centres of palatial systems in the Bronze Age, they were small fry by his own time. And we can look at the arms and armour as well. We don't quite see the variety of arms and armour that we see on the pottery of the time in the Bronze Age. But Homer consistently talks about rounded, bossed shields, which are not the shields that we see in the classical 5th century on hoplites. And in the 8th century, the most common type of shield seems to have been square or dipylon shields. The way they do battle also seems to be consistent with what we see on pottery in the Bronze Age, such as using chariots to get around the battlefield and the use of the double spear. Some other hints that Homer knows far more about the Bronze Age than he should, and so perhaps is giving us stories actually told during the Bronze Age, are things like the societal structure. Focused around singular individual palaces with multiple smaller lords paying fealty to them, this was something very much of the Bronze Age, not the classical. The layout of Odysseus' palace is similar to those we see in Mycenaean and Minoan culture, as is the role of iron, which is mostly used for tools or simple things like chains and rings, rather than for weapons and armour themselves. And there are other clues in the language of Homer. The one time Homer talks about writing in the Iliad, the way he does so suggests he doesn't actually know what writing is, which reinforces this idea he is someone writing in a time without writing, about a story when writing did exist. So then, we should expect from Homer a solidly end of Bronze Age story, with perhaps some anachronisms from classical times reflecting Homer's own understanding of the ancient world. Or we could see it from the time of the Pisistrates, a classical interpretation of that Homeric work, but it is very clearly set in a different world to the one Homer lives, a world of palaces, a world of bronze, a world of chariots, and a world of these great heroes. So this idea that it doesn't matter because it was just a myth, but it was real to the Greeks. And you know what? It was set in a real time at a real place, so we should respect that choice. And saying that it doesn't matter, it's just a film, is disingenuous, because as soon as you start talking about a historical period and showing it to people, whether you like it or not, you are an educator. Very few people are picking up a book on the Bronze Age. I'm as shocked as you are, but it doesn't happen very often. So this is how people will learn about this time period, and if we are misleading them, then we are betraying our role as educator. So then, finally, at last, let's talk about Christopher Nolan. First off, let's go through what Nolan's doing right here. He's actually telling the story of the Odyssey, which is a low bar, I know, but considering how far Troy deviated from the story, I think it's fair to give praise where it's due. We seem to be getting Odysseus going to the land of the dead. He's fighting a Cyclops. We're going to have Penelope and Telemachus. We're even going to get Telemachus' journey to Nestor and Menelaus asking where his dad is, which is something I don't think I've actually seen in an Odyssey adaptation before. And when we look at the setting and the scenery, it's clear that the set designers have clearly tried. I talked about in the last video that we did on the Odyssey that there are Minoan wall paintings behind him in the backgrounds. And yes, thank you whoever that was. When we look at Odysseus' palace on Ithaca, the place he's trying to get home to, I mean, it's humongous, but the layout of it, and especially the columns, are in fact what we expect from a Bronze Age palace. So well done, set designers. 10 out of 10. Well, 8 out of 10 set designers. You've done well. But on the topic of art, I think we should talk about the horse itself. In the trailer, we see the wooden horse, the famous wooden horse they're going to climb inside of and get into the city of Troy, built from the ships of the Greek dead. First off, we are obviously going to compare it to the horse from Troy, because that is the main comparison. I think this one comes out worse for it, because the one from Troy is not only larger and seems like it would fit more men in, it actually looks like it's made out of ships. Terrific design decision. But what's strange about this wooden horse is the pose and the sculpture of it. It looks, at the best, it's probably high classical 4th, 5th century. This is not what horses in the Bronze Age really look like in their statues. But as I said, Homer was also no stranger to anachronism, so we can give them a pass in some of these things. I just think it looks a bit weird. I'm not a huge fan of the horse design. We've talked about the horse, we've talked about the palace. Where else are we going to talk about? That's right, the boat. The film Troy used classical triremes, recognisable from that pointed beak at the front. And then you look at the returns, but you do see a lot of small ships that look very plausible and very much like what a small Bronze Age fishing ship would look like. Then we go to the Odyssey, and I've seen people compare this to a Viking longship. And fair enough, I can see the comparisons. But there are actually classical models for this kind of ship. When we look at the Bronze Age evidence, we see ships that look like classical triremes, like from Troy. But we also see ships with double-pointed ends. They even, some of them, look like they have figureheads of birds, which may be why Homer calls all of his ships beaked ships. Rather than referring to the classical bronze beaks of a ram at the front of your trireme, he may be talking about these sort of duck-billed ships. But what there doesn't seem to be in the Bronze Age record is one where both ends of the ship curl inwards. The last main thing to consider then is, of course, the armour and the helmets and the weapons and the shields and all that jazz. I've talked a bit about the helmets already in my previous video. The armour and helmets generally seem to be made out of either a very, very patinaed bronze or it's just leather. If it's the latter, very disappointing. If it's the former, actually fair enough. They've been at war for 10 years. Their armour's not going to be in pristine condition. Achilles' armour is a bit bizarre. I think adding Achilles to the Odyssey generally is a mistake. Are we going to get the whole Trojan War? But Achilles' armour, I'm not a huge fan of the actual style of it, but I don't think it's an issue historically because his armour was made by the gods. The gods can make their armour look like whatever they want to. If they wanted to make it look like it's got a spinal cord on it and give him the highest cheekbones of the universe, fine, whatever, go for it. His armour is meant to be distinctive. You are meant to recognise Achilles from a long way. So I actually don't mind this. In fact, what annoys me is that we don't see more of this inventiveness, more of this variety. What we seem to see a lot of is round bossed shields, yay, well done, swords, shields, cuirasses, helmets that all look exactly the same. And this is not the case for the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age was a glorious time where people tried all sorts of insane outfits and they look fantastic. If you want someone who's really heavily armoured, you could even do a panoply. This was the full plate armour of the age, and the way Menelaus' armour is described might be referring to this overlapping plates. I would love to see one of these on the big screen. And I think most of the problems boil down to this. Why are you doing this? Why are you showing us the same thing we've seen 100 times? Why are you showing us armour that doesn't even look as good as the armour in Troy? When instead you could show us the glorious variety of the ancient world. Why does everything look like it's been through 100 filters of black so there's no colour anywhere when the ancient world was a bright and vibrant place? The Return was a dour and dim film showing Odysseus' return home to slaughter the suitors of his wife. But when it was outside, in the Greek countryside, it was gloriously colourful, and it made you want to go there on holiday. In fact, so much so, I think maybe the Greek government paid them. And the suitors wear different coloured outfits. They wear reds and blues and yellows and greens. In Nolan's Odyssey, we don't see very much of this, and where there should be colour and life, there isn't. The walls of his palace should be brightly painted. The columns should be brightly painted. His cloak is meant to be incredibly fine, and his tunic made so that it looks like the dried skin of an onion that would amaze all the women. They're meant to have beautiful outfits. Ancient people took pride in being colourful and gorgeous and showing their wealth. Why do we never get to see this? It's Napoleon all over again. In Napoleon, they had beautiful, period-correct outfits in a bright variety of colours, and as soon as they put it on the screen, bam, all that colour, all that life is taken away. Why are we doing this again? Yes, the historicity is an issue. It seems like Nolan doesn't have a particular vision in mind. More importantly to me is not the missteps, but the missed opportunities. This is something which, strangely, video games do a lot better. You can see the beautiful palace of Odysseus in Assassin's Creed Odyssey and get a real sense of what it might have been like. Troy Total War did a really good job of showcasing the variety and breadth of ancient arms and armour. Whatever you think of the cast, and I have very mixed feelings about the cast, and whatever you think about the dourness of the colour, which I've been grumpy about, in terms of historicity, this is already a really mixed bag. I guess we're just going to have to wait and see how it all comes out.